I have told this story only once in my life, to a man I trusted, and even then I held the worst of it back, because there are cruelties that resist ordinary language. I am telling it now in full because she asked me to. Not for sympathy and not for justice. She said both of those had already been given to her in fuller measure than she had dared hope for. She asked me to tell it so that other men might understand what can be done to a woman, with nothing more than a locked door and a well-placed word. My name is Lord Edmund Carew. I have been Marcus Ashford's closest friend since we were boys of 11 in the mud of a Shropshire schoolyard. I know his silences and his rages, his rare warmth and his even rarer laughter. I know the shape of his grief, because I stood beside him when his father died and left him the dukedom of Grenadern, a Highland title wrapped around a northern English estate, proud and cold and enormous. And I know the shape of his guilt, because I was there the night he came to understand what had been done to Miss Cesile Ren under his very own roof. He did not know she was there. That is the first thing you must understand. Grenadern Hall had 2 wings. The east wing housed the family rooms and the great gallery and the library Marcus used from dawn until he could no longer keep his eyes open. The west wing had been shuttered since his father's time, its corridors dim and its rooms cold, used for little more than storing surplus furniture and the kind of household clutter that accumulates when a large family shrinks to one. Marcus had no reason to go there. He had told no one to go there. And so no one who served him knew that a woman was living in the west wing's farthest room, because the man who had placed her there had made arrangements with a housekeeper since dismissed, paid monthly in coin from a private account, and told the new household staff only that the room was under a private family instruction and was not to be disturbed. The man who had placed her there was her guardian. His name is not worth my giving here. He was her mother's brother, a gentleman of comfortable fortune and considerable pride, and he had looked at Cesile Ren, her modest inheritance, her clear eyes, her inconvenient habit of asking direct questions, and decided she was a problem to be managed. Her father had left her a settled income and a house of her own to be delivered at her majority, or upon her marriage if it came first. Her guardian had control of those funds until one of those events occurred. And so the simplest way to ensure neither event occurred was to ensure she never left the room where he had placed her. He told the physicians that she was hysterical. He told the magistrate that she was a danger to herself. He told Marcus's old housekeeper, now long dismissed, that she was a ward under a doctor's care, requiring quiet and isolation for the good of her health. He told Cecily every time he visited that she was mad, that her memories were confused, that the letters she wrote careful, specific, addressed to lawyers and distant cousins and anyone she thought might listen were a symptom of her distress. He took the letters when he left. He told her they had been sent and had received no reply. He brought her books and candles and decent meals, and a physician on quarterly visits who had been instructed to record that the patient remained confused and agitated. And for 2 years, Cesile Ren lived in a room in the west wing of Grenadern Hall and was told, with patient regularity, that she could not trust the evidence of her own mind. She resisted. That is the part I want you to understand before anything else. Cesile Ren was not a woman who surrendered quietly, even under the most sustained and deliberate pressure. She resisted by the only means available to her, by holding every single morning to what she knew was true. She would recite facts to herself in the early hours, before the house woke, the name of the village where she had grown up, the color of her father's study door, the exact phrasing of the clause in her father's will that established her settled income at majority. She recited these things the way a traveler in a gale holds a rope, hand over hand, not because holding feels heroic, but because letting go feels worse. She told me this herself, months later, with the dry matter-of-factness that was always her mode, and she said it without any apparent expectation of being admired for it. It was simply what she had done because the alternative was not surviving. The physician's quarterly visits were the worst of it, she said. Not because the man was unkind. He was not unkind, which made it worse in its own way, but because he was professional, and a professional record in careful medical Latin carries a particular weight that a guardian's word alone does not. She could counter her guardian's word, at least in her own mind. She could hold up against it her own recollections, her own reasoning, the accumulating evidence of her own senses. But a man of science writing with the authority of learning that the patient remained confused and displayed agitation when pressed on certain topics, that was harder to stand against. because the confusion he was recording was not invention. After a year of isolation, she said, she had begun to feel genuinely unmoored at intervals. The facts she held to were still there, but the feeling of certainty had thinned, the way the rope thins when it is wet. She had to hold tighter, and the tighter she held, the more exhausted she became. And the more exhausted she became, the harder it was to believe that the effort had any purpose, because no one had come and the letters had not been answered. And the man across the table told her pleasantly that she had imagined the rope. She found the gap in the wainscoting in her second autumn. A loose board in the back servant's passage, discovered in the course of pressing her palm methodically along every panel of every wall in her room, and the small corridor outside it during the long evenings when she could not sleep. She worked the board free over weeks with a hairpin and the corner of a book cover. The passage ran, in its cold and cobwebbed way, to a corridor connecting the west wing to the east, and the east corridor led, eventually, to the library. She did not rush. She mapped the route first, in multiple cautious passages in the small hours, learning the house sounds, establishing which servants walked which routes, measuring distances. She catalogued the schedule of the household with the systematic attention of someone who has nothing to distract her from the task. When she was entirely certain, she went to the library in daylight, on a morning when she had heard Marcus leave with his traveling bags for London. She had 3 hours. She used them with the concentration of a woman who knows she will not have another chance this convenient. The documents she needed were not concealed. Marcus kept his estate records in meticulous order, and the trust documents relating to the Ren family income were filed in the third drawer of the main desk under a heading that any literate person could find. She did not remove them. She read them where they lay, memorizing figures and dates and the language of the specific clauses, cross-referencing what she found against what she held in her memory of the original terms her father had explained to her when she was 17 years old, and he was still alive to explain anything. The discrepancies she found were not subtle. They were the discrepancies of a man who had grown complacent over 2 years of uncontested access, quarterly withdrawals coded to estate maintenance that corresponded to no work contracted, account figures that had been adjusted from their recorded receipts, an interest calculation that bore no relationship to the rates stipulated in the founding document. The evidence was extensive, and it was clear, and it would have been found by any solicitor given an hour and cause to look. She replaced everything. She returned through the passage, and then she sat at the small table in her room and wrote the most deliberate letter she had ever composed. 3 pages in the controlled hand she had been practicing to keep steady. She addressed it to the Duke of Grenadern, identified herself in the first line, set out her circumstances in the second paragraph with the precision of a formal statement, and devoted the remainder to the financial evidence she had found, account numbers, dates, specific figures, the relevant clause in the original trust document against which each discrepancy stood. She crossed nothing out. She said that she did not ask for his pity, that she asked only that he read the documents she had cited and decide for himself what they described, that she was in room 7 of the West Wing and would be there tomorrow and the day after, that she had nowhere else to be. She slid the letter under the East Library door on an October morning, when the house sounds told her he had returned. I was with Marcus when he found it. We had come in from a wet ride, both of us muddy and out of temper about a drainage dispute on the North Field, and he picked the letter up from the floor with the mechanical distraction of a man who expects correspondence about household bills. He read the first line. He stopped walking. The mud on his boots dripped quietly onto the flagstone floor, and neither of us noticed. He read the letter twice. Then he read it a third time, his jaw set, his expression going past anger into something colder and more deliberate, the look of a man who has understood something clearly and is deciding, very precisely, what to do about it. Then he handed it to me without a word. I read it again. I looked up and Marcus was already at the door. He went alone. He insisted on it, quietly but completely, over my objection, and his reasoning was simple. Cesile Ren had spent 2 years in a room in this house and had written a letter to a stranger asking to be believed, and the first man to open that door ought to be the one who could actually do something about it, not a witness. I sat in the library with her letter in my hands and read it a 4th time, listening to his footsteps cross the entrance hall and take the west corridor, and I knew I was in the presence of a moment I would carry for the rest of my life. He told me afterward what he found. The room was cold colder than it ought to have been, even for a north-facing room in October, because the fire had been banked low and was by that hour little more than embers. She was sitting at the small table near the window with a book open before her, and she looked up when the door opened without flinching, without rising, with the measured, still attention of a woman who had placed evidence before a court and was waiting for the verdict with her spine straight. Not pleading, not afraid. Waiting in the way of a woman who has been waiting a long time and has learned to make it look like something other than waiting. He said, "Miss Ren, I am Marcus Ashford. I read your letter." She said, "I know who you are. I have lived in your house for 2 years." He told me there was a silence, and that he felt it as a fair rebuke, not one she had intended as such, he thought, but one that existed regardless and which he accepted as his due. He pulled the second chair to the table and sat down across from her, and asked her to tell him everything from the beginning. She did. It took an hour and a half. She spoke in the same clear, controlled voice as the letter, without self-pity and without embellishment, correcting herself occasionally when she felt she had overstated something and going back to amend it with the precision of someone giving sworn testimony. He asked her questions. He told me afterward that he had been looking, not for inconsistencies exactly, but for any place where the account strained against its own logic, where the claimed sequence of events required something improbable. He found nothing. He had sat across from a woman who had been told for 2 years that her mind was unreliable, and he had watched her mind work with a rigor and an accuracy that made the claim against it look like exactly what it was. A convenience arranged for a specific financial purpose, nothing more. He came back to the library and stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at me with an expression I will not try to characterize, because I do not have words adequate to it. "I need a solicitor," he said, "the best one you know, tonight." I sent an express to London within the hour. What followed required 3 weeks, and a discretion I will only partially recount here. The solicitor Marcus engaged, a man of 30 years' experience with estate trusts, confirmed Cecile's accounting within 2 days of examining the documents. He said the word straightforward with a flatness that made the guardian's position very clear. The guardian, when presented with the evidence in a meeting attended by the solicitor, Marcus, and a magistrate's representative, did not contest a single figure. He did not protest his innocence. He signed the documents that were placed before him with the efficiency of a man who has calculated that cooperation is now his most advantageous course. He left the county before the week was out. Marcus could have pursued the matter further than he did. Cecile asked him not to. Not out of mercy for her guardian, she said, looking at Marcus with the direct, measured gaze that was entirely her own, but because a public trial would require her to sit before strangers and perform her suffering in detail, and she had performed enough already. The income was restored, the house was opened and staffed, her affairs were in every legal respect entire. And in the meantime, Cesile Ren was still at Grenadern Hall, because there were documents to review and arrangements to be confirmed, and Marcus had provided a proper suite of rooms in the East Wing, and a lady's maid, and every courtesy that the previous 2 years had conspicuously withheld, and had said nothing about any of it beyond what was necessary to say. He was a man shaped by a particular Northern English culture that rated practical competence above sentiment and silence, above discussion of anything that mattered too much. He had applied this culture efficiently to the crisis and resolved it. The resolving of it, however, required him to spend 3 weeks in regular conversation with Cecile Ren, over the documents, over the solicitor's reports, over the questions of the house and the income and the arrangements that needed making. And the woman he found himself in regular conversation with was not someone he found it easy to set aside when the conversation was finished. She had expected, I believe, to find someone damaged. Not in a contemptuous way. Marcus Ashford had no contempt for women, and less for women who had been wronged than for almost anything else on earth, but in the way of a decent man who has heard an account of serious harm and braces himself to deal carefully with its aftermath. What he had not braced himself for was a woman who was, in most material respects, the least damaged person in the room. She asked questions with the same precision she brought to everything, not personal questions at first, but questions about the estate, the county, the history of the hall, the management of the Northfield dispute that had been occupying Marcus when her letter arrived. He answered them because they were interesting questions, and she had intelligent reasons for asking them. She had views about what she read in the East Library, which she expressed in the dry, exact way that was native to her, without particular interest in whether those views would be well received. They were always well received, because they were always either right or argued with sufficient rigor that the distinction was hard to establish. I watched Marcus in those 3 weeks undergo a change I recognized because I had watched for 40 years and knew his expressions well. I watched him come to dinner on time, which was unusual. I watched him ask Cecile's opinion on a tenancy matter and listen with the full attention he gave to almost nobody. I watched him notice when she was cold in the gallery and arrange for the fire to be made up without comment and without looking for acknowledgement. I watched him one afternoon in the library sit across a table from her for the better part of an hour while they both read in silence, and look up from his page at intervals with the expression of a man who has unexpectedly found himself exactly where he wishes to be and is being careful not to disturb it. I was enjoying this enormously. I made no comment and enjoyed it all the more thoroughly for the restraint. It was the evening before her planned departure that things nearly fell to pieces in the manner characteristic of two extremely self-contained people who have each decided, independently, to wait for the other to speak first. Cecily had thanked Marcus for dinner with the directness that was always hers, said the carriage was arranged for the following morning, and risen to go. Marcus had risen, as one does, and then neither of them moved, which is the point at which I discovered an urgent interest in the bookcase at the far end of the room. He said her name, just that, Miss Ren. She turned and looked at him and waited, in the patient way she had, without assisting him. I will not reconstruct their conversation word for word, because it was not mine to hear, and I heard only the portion that reached me at the far bookcase. I know that Marcus told her he was aware the house had not been, for her, a kindness. That he had failed to know what was occurring in it, and that this failure had cost her 2 years she could not recover, and that he understood she had no reason to credit him with anything beyond the correction of a harm he had not had the attentiveness to prevent. I know that he told her he wished, very much, that she would stay. Not as a guest, not as someone under his roof's protection, a phrase that had been used against her already and that she had every reason to distrust. As herself, as the person she was, who had arrived in his house against her will and had shown him, in 3 weeks of honest exchange, more of what a person could be than he had encountered in the 37 years previous. That she owed him nothing, and that he was asking anyway, because the thought of her leaving was one he could not approach without a hollow quality settling into the walls around him. She was quiet for a moment. He told me later that the moment felt considerably longer than its clock duration. Then she told him that she had spent 2 years learning to hold onto what she knew was true when a great deal of concerted effort was being applied to convince her otherwise, and that what she knew at this particular moment was that she had not wanted to leave for the past week, and had been waiting to determine whether that was a feeling worth attending to. He said, to his credit and without hesitation, "It is." She stayed. They were married in March in the private chapel at Grenadern Hall on a morning when the early light came in pale and cold through the east windows and lay across the stone floor in long, clear bars. There was no county audience. There was no occasion. There was a vicar who understood that the couple before him required a short address rather than a homily and gave exactly that, a man of good sense and evident warmth. I stood for Marcus. Her solicitor stood for her. The 4 of us and the vicar made the whole of the proceedings, and I do not believe any of us wanted it otherwise. I have watched Marcus Ashford for 40 years. I have seen him in grief and in anger, and in the particular steely calm that he deploys when he is very much the most frightened person in the room and refuses to show it. I have seen him happy, in the intermittent, slightly startled way of a man who did not expect happiness to arrive, and is not quite sure what to do with it now that it has. What I saw when Cecily came into that chapel was different from all of it. He looked like a man who had been given something that he was not certain he deserved and had decided without any further discussion to spend the remainder of his life being worthy of it. No triumph, no relief. Only that clear, steady attention he brought to the things that most mattered, the same attention that had sent him down the West Corridor, alone on an October morning, with someone else's letter in his hand. They have been married 2 years now. The West Wing is open, and the room where she lived is a storage room again, which I think is the correct fate for it. Cecily manages the household with the same organized rigor she brought to memorizing trust documents in a cold library at an unaccountable hour. and the estate is in better order than it has been since Marcus's grandfather's time. They read in the East Library together most evenings, in a companionable silence that requires no maintenance. He looks up from his page at her at intervals, with the expression I noticed during those October weeks, the expression of a man who is glad to be exactly where he is. I asked her once, late in the afternoon of the wedding, when Marcus had been claimed by one or two estate matters, and she and I had a few minutes at the window with the gardens below us going pale in the early spring light, whether any of it felt strange. The library where she had found the documents, the corridor through the wainscoting, the room itself. She thought about it in the careful way she thinks about everything. "Not strange," she said. "I always knew what I was." He simply knew it, too. Then she went to find her husband, and I stood at the window with my glass and thought about the letter she had slid under the library door on an October morning, 3 pages in a steady hand, the evidence arranged with the rigor of a person who had concluded that her only reliable instrument was her own mind and had proceeded accordingly. 3 pages and the final line, "I will be there tomorrow and the day after. I have nowhere else to be." What her guardian had calculated was that isolation would undo her. That if you tell a woman often enough and consistently enough that she cannot be trusted, she will eventually hand you the key to herself. He had not accounted for a woman who spent 2 years choosing, every single morning, to trust herself anyway. Who had not written the letter because she expected rescue, but because she had assembled the evidence and determined that placing it before the correct person was the logical next action. Who had told the most powerful man in 3 counties that she did not ask for his pity, and had meant it, because she had already given herself everything pity could have offered, and had discovered that what she required was not pity but an accurate witness. Marcus knew and has always said plainly that he did not save her. He opened a door she had already found the key to. What he gave her, what she allowed him to give her, because she was always very careful about what she allowed, was the particular rest of being seen by someone who could see clearly, who had no investment in what she owed him, and who was large enough in his own life not to be unsettled by the size of what she was. That is not nothing. That is, if you will allow an old man the observation, very nearly everything. I am not a sentimental person on the whole. I was raised to be as unsentimental as the English gentry produces, which is to say quite thoroughly. But I have never stopped being glad that I was in the East Library on that muddy October morning, when Marcus's boots stopped on the flagstone floor, and he read a letter from a woman the world had decided was mad, and decided instead that what he was reading was the clearest mind he had ever encountered. He was right, he usually is, about the things that matter. I have a few years on him, and I could not have done better myself. I have asked myself many times in the years since what I would have done in her position. I do not think I would have done as well. I am a man of reasonable intelligence and tolerable courage, and I have faced various difficulties in my life without disgrace. But I have never faced the particular difficulty of having my own mind declared the enemy. That requires a different quality of steadiness, not the steadiness of bracing against a visible force, but the steadiness of refusing to be dissolved by something you cannot see or name or argue against, something that works by slow accumulation, by small repetitions, by the gentle, insistent pressure of a man who sits across from you and speaks in a reasonable voice and explains with every appearance of concern for your welfare that you have remembered wrong. I think about the 11 letters she wrote. She described them to me once, briefly, the care with which she composed each one, choosing the recipient, choosing the argument, making her case in the most legible way she could imagine. She was aware from the beginning that the letters might be intercepted. She wrote them anyway because writing them was itself a form of resistance, an insistence that she was a person with communications to make, that her thoughts existed and were worth setting down, regardless of whether anyone received them. She told me this in the flat, analytical tone she brings to everything, and I do not think she intended it to move me, but it did, because I understood what she was describing. A woman keeping faith with the fact of her own existence, for 2 years, in a cold room with no particular evidence that the faith was warranted. The faith was warranted, but she did not know that when she was keeping it. The guardian had underestimated her in one specific, decisive way. He had assumed that what sustained her account of herself was confidence, the ordinary social confidence of a person accustomed to being believed, which 2 years of systematic contradiction would wear down. He was wrong about what sustained it. It was not confidence. It was rigor. Cecile Ren did not need to be believed by others in order to believe herself, because she did not take other people's belief as the foundation of her own account. She had her evidence. She had the figures she had memorized, the dates, the wording of her father's will, the exact sequence of events she had witnessed. These things were not dependent on anyone's agreement. A number is what it is regardless of who credits it. She held to the numbers and the numbers held. It was not easy, but it was possible and she did it. Marcus understood this when she explained it to him during those 3 October weeks. I know because he told me late one evening after she had retired, standing in the library doorway with his glass in his hand and the particular expression he wears when something has reached him more than he intended it to. He said, "She is more rigorous than anyone I have ever met." He paused. "She should be at Oxford. She should have been at Oxford 10 years ago." The grief in it was for what had been taken from her, and it was entirely genuine, and I did not say anything because there was nothing useful to say. What I did say about a week later, when it had become clear that his feelings for Cecile Ren were not of the temporary or merely gallant variety, was this: "The woman does not need to be protected, Marcus. She has been protecting herself rather efficiently for 2 years without you. What she might possibly need is a person who is on her side." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Yes, I know." And he went to tell her he wished her to stay. She said yes, not in the language of softness or gratitude, but in the language of her own clear-eyed determination, that she had not wanted to leave, and that wanting counted. It struck me, listening from the far bookcase, as the most romantic thing I had heard in 40 years of observing marriages, not the sentiment of it, but the precision. She knew what she felt. She said what she felt. She had spent 2 years having her account of reality contested, and she was not inclined, on this occasion, to contest it herself. I refilled my glass very quietly, and found the bookcase more absorbing than ever. There is one last thing I want to record, because it seems to me the most important. On the evening after the wedding, when the 4 of us had sat to a quiet supper, and the vicar had gone home, and the solicitor had retired to his guest room, Marcus and Cecily sat for an hour in the East Library in the usual companionable silence. I was in the chair by the fire with my book, and I was not reading it. I was watching them without appearing to watch them, a skill I have perfected over 4 decades, and what I saw was this. Marcus looked up from his page, looked at his wife, and she looked up at exactly the same moment and met his eyes, and neither of them said anything. Then they both looked back to their books. I have been to grander weddings. I have seen more spectacular declarations. I have watched a duke claim a woman publicly in a ballroom before a crowd that gasped, and I confess the crowd and the gasping made an impression. But I have never witnessed anything that moved me more than that exchange of glances over 2 open books in a cold library on a March evening, because I knew what it had taken to arrive at a moment that simple. She had carried her account of herself through 2 years of deliberate erasure and arrived, at the far end of it, still in possession of everything that mattered. He had read a letter, opened a door, and had the good sense to understand what he was looking at. The rest had followed with a naturalness that neither of them would call romantic, because neither of them was inclined toward that word, but which was, in every substance, exactly that. I closed my book, finished my glass, and left them to it,